Oh shit.
Oh Lordy, Black Betty. Bam-a-lam, 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 bam-a-lam.
Okay, Vomniacs, it is on to the next and final guest at BlackVomit's Black History Month Cookout. So I chose a favorite of mine, and her name is Phillis Wheatley. Sounds so sweet when you say it. But Phillis Wheatley wasn't sweet. Phillis Wheatley was the queen of subliminal clapbacks. Like, y'all, 18th century abolitionists owe much to her use of subtle persuasion and biblically expressive words that Phillis Wheatley weaved into her poetry. She had the very frustrating goal of trying to convert minds of people who saw people like Phillis Wheatley as less than human. If you ask me, sis was practically a double agent. Unfortunately, due to how well Phillis Wheatley had assimilated into the customs and culture of her masters and her love of America, she would face backlash from some of her fellow African Americans. Now, to be clear, there was no way for most African Americans or blacks to understand the use of her rhetoric, as they were kept largely uneducated. So when she showed thanks for being brought from Africa to America, basically thanking her enslavers for enslaving her, most took it at face value instead of looking deeper under the words. But that could have been a good thing, because if the African Americans believed her, what do you think the slavers did? She literally Jedi mind tricked, reverse psychology, whatever you want to call it, the racists into feeling guilty. Truly ahead of her time. Born in 1753 in Gambia, Africa, Phillis Wheatley would be assumed 7 or 8 years old when she was kidnapped and taken from her home. She would be sold as a domestic slave to the Wheatley family in Boston, Massachusetts. According to sources, she was too frail to be sold as a laborer in the West Indian or Southern colonies. Something that I learned while researching that I was unaware of beforehand that really sent me is that Phillis' name comes from the boat that brought her to America. It was called the Phillis. And I don't know why, but that just doesn't sit right with me, with my spirit. It would be the Wheatley children who would introduce Phillis to letters with chalk. When Mr. and Mrs. Wheatley discovered her budding intelligence, they encouraged it, something she managed to do within 16 months. By 14, Phillis was proficient in the Bible, astronomy, geography, history, British literature, the Greek and Latin classics. And she could read and greet in Latin too. I could barely speak English. Don't get it twisted though, because despite her talents and her intellect, Phillis was still a slave, and she was always kept in a slave's place, near Mrs. Wheatley. Phillis was not allowed to leave her side, nor was she allowed to fraternize with any other slaves the Wheatleys owned. They purposefully kept her isolated, both physically and mentally, as none of the other slaves were able to receive education or any of the other luxuries that Phillis had. Even knowing that her life was rich and unusual, to say the least, as a slave, Phillis still yearned for more academic environments. Phillis would publish her first poem in 1767, but it was an elegy written for George Whitefield in 1770 that really sent her into international fame. No one could believe that Phillis Wheatley was able to do what she and the Wheatleys claimed that she could do. It went against a lot of the long-standing ignorant ideals and customs, people who profited from slavery. They tried everything to discredit her, from demanding she show her talents in front of groups of people in order to judge her validity, to even straight up being accused of having someone else write or memorize it for her. It got to the point where Mrs. Wheatley was just like, I can't get any of your poems published, so I'm gonna send you and my son off to London in order to find a backer. And they were indeed able to find a publisher in the Countess of Huntingdon, Selina Hastings. Phillis would go on to publish a whole collection of poems, but once she got to America, she still needed to have validation that she, as a Black woman, was capable of writing such eloquent poetry. So to prove her legitimacy and that she was the actual intellect behind her poem, her collection was sold with a foreword that supported her work and that the work was indeed her own and had it signed by several notable prominent white men, one of which was John Hancock. It also came with one of the most famous portraits of her. Well, the only portrait. Yes, so we can see the spectacle. This would make her the first Black woman in America to write and publish her own book. One of her most famous and one of my most favorite poems of hers is titled On Being Brought from Africa to America. It perfectly exemplifies how Phillis' use of biblical allusion, patriotism, and life experiences could have allowed abolitionist ideals to seep into the mind of good old slave-owning Christians. Not only in a way that was enjoyable for them, so they would actually pick up the book and read it and finish it, but more importantly, in a way that was safe for her to express to the world. Because, y'all, what she was doing was not safe for her to be doing at the time. By age 18, Phillis had over 28 collections of poems out, widely enjoyed and debated over. She had written several letters to ministers about freedom and abolitionists, ironically remaining a slave throughout her fame, all the way up until 3 months before Mrs. Wheatley's death in 1774. Unfortunately, with her benefactor dying, so went the life that Phillis Wheatley had grown accustomed to. Having escaped most of the terrors of slavery, and being quite ignorant on the harsh economic environment for freed Black people, she was not well equipped to be on her own. Phillis would go on to marry a John Peters and have 3 kids, even though none of them would survive to adulthood. She continued to write, but as the years went on, her writing no longer could support her or her family. She was forced to take on jobs like being a maid just to make money. Her husband, although a very smart entrepreneur, just could not make enough to support the both of them. And as the story goes, he acquired hefty debts and had to flee his creditors. So Phillis was often left alone to fend for herself. On December 5th, 1784, uncared for, alone, and in poverty, Phillis Wheatley would die. Phillis' story has always been one that I could relate to, but it's one that anyone could relate to. If you ever felt like an outsider in your own community, or frustrated at having to validate oneself, or just being misunderstood, just know this ain't our first rodeo, and it most definitely won't be our last. So for being one of the greats that made sure that we had a seat at the table, and an honor on how she would eat those bigots up, consider your spot reserved, Phillis. I'm the Nubian Bad Goddess, and this has been BlackVomit's Black History Month Cookout. Phillis, you ever think about changing your name?